Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, where we take the topics from the Hindu and analyze them as per the demands of civil services examination. The topics of discussion are listed on your screen.
Moving on to the first article of the day that has featured in the Hindu, basically talks about No Money for Terror conference that was recently held in India and highlights the issue of growing international cross-border terrorism across the world. Now this topic is particularly important as it falls in the GS3 section under the internal security part, and UPSC in the previous year, that is in 2017 and 2016, has asked questions related to terrorism. So we need to understand this topic in detail and have an understanding for the same. During the discussion, we will try to understand various topics which are terrorism, the debates on terrorism, that is on the definition of terrorism, kinds of terrorism, that is if they are state sponsored or ideological, what are the root causes of terrorism, effects of terrorism, steps to counter terrorism, and the issue of terror financing and how we can counter it. Now, a further and detailed reading of the same can be done from Mains Compass of 2022, which has dedicated a chapter on terrorism for the same. And for the international response and as a global way forward to response toward terrorism can be seen on the discussion of 9th November, which was taken by Naved sir. Now, before starting our detailed discussion on terrorism, we should understand what was this NMFT conference. A 2-day conference was organized which offers a unique platform for the participating nations and the organization to deliberate on the effectiveness of the current international regime on counter-terrorism financing and the steps required to address the emerging challenges. This was the third conference which was organized in India and has been earlier organized in Paris in 2018 and in Melbourne in 2019. The conference was to be organized in India in the year 2020 but got delayed due to the pandemic. The major aim of the conference is to enhance global cooperation to deny finances to terrorists and access to permissive jurisdiction of operation. Now, there were some key highlights from the speech of Prime Minister Modi. Under his speech, Prime Minister Modi highlighted that there is no good terrorism and bad terrorism, and it is an attack on humanity, freedom, and civilization. Further, Prime Minister Modi emphasized that a uniform, unified, and a zero-tolerance approach can only defeat terrorism. Prime Minister Modi also made a distinction between fighting a terrorist and fighting terrorism, wherein he explained that a terrorist is an individual, but terrorism is about a network of individuals, and exclaimed that attack is the best form of defense in uprooting the terrorism and needs a larger, proactive and systematic response. He also made the remark over states' support for terror and as a major source of political, ideological and financial support to terrorism coming from the state itself, and exclaimed that organizations and the individuals that try to create sympathy for terrorists must be isolated. He further highlighted that organized crime is also emerging as a source of funding for terrorism and highlighted the deep links between criminal gangs and terrorist outfit, and thus remarked the importance of action against organized crime as critical in fighting against the terror. He also highlighted the importance of international institutions that were handling terrorism, for example, United Nations Security Council, FATF, Financial Intelligence Unit, the Egmont Group, etc. Prime Minister Modi in the speech also highlighted the new mix of technology and terrorism, wherein he highlighted that new kinds of technology are being used for terror financing and recruitment. The challenges coming from the darknet, private currencies were also highlighted under his statement. Cyber terrorism also got a reflection under Prime Minister Modi's speech. At last, Prime Minister Modi concluded that a common approach to terrorism is the need of the hour, and terrorists should not be allowed to misuse differences in legal principles, procedures and processes in different countries. And he highlighted that this can only be prevented through deeper coordination and understanding between the governments, joint operation, intelligence coordination, which includes intelligence sharing, extradition to help the fight menace of terror. Now we'll begin our discussion by understanding the definition of terrorism and the various debates regarding it. Now, while understanding these topics, we should be very clear that we should first try to understand the topic in detail. The supplementary notes have been provided under the description section and can be downloaded from there. Thus, the prime focus should be on the understanding. So, what do we mean by terrorism? The term terrorism first originated during the reign of terror in 1793-94 at the time of French Revolution. Following the World War II, the focus of terrorist activity shifted from Europe to that of Middle East, Africa, Asia, with the emergence of various nationalistic and anti-colonial groups in these regions. Left-wing extremism, as also exclaimed as a form of terrorism by many scholars, was also experienced in the countries of Third World, which was based on the belief that violence is the only strategy of revolutionary movement during the late 1950s. International terrorism today is marked by a large number of transnational terrorist groups which are mostly motivated by the Islamist fundamentalist ideology like that of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Now these two organizations also found a mention during the speech made by Prime Minister Modi and that of Home Minister Amit Shah during the recent conference. So there has been a historic debate on the definition of terrorism. Terrorism, as by many scholars, is defined as a systematic use of violence to create a general climate of fear in population and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. Terrorism is unlawful use or threatened use of violence against the civilians, often to achieve political, religious or similar objectives. Now, this definition make it very different from that of organized crime. Basically, there are two major differences between terrorism and that of organized crime. The first difference between terrorism and that of organized crime is terrorism is media hungry, that is, they crave media attention, which is not required as organized crime as it mostly functions under the carpet to avoid any worth from the investigative or the security agencies of the respective country. The second major difference between the terrorism and that of organized crime is terrorism is mostly for any political objective or some religious objective, whereas organized crime use the lacunae of the laws without having any political objectives. Despite of terrorism as being recognized as a global phenomena, attempts to arrive at an internationally accepted definition of terrorism have been futile. This ambivalence is due to two primary reasons. That is, a terrorist in one country may be viewed as a freedom fighter in another. They feel that their demands are legitimate and non-state violence is thus justified. Secondly, some states resort to or encourage various kinds of criminal acts clandestinely through their own agency or via hired agents to subvert or otherwise destabilize another lawfully established government. So, due to these reasons, there has been a debate on what constitutes definition of terrorism, and thus it has not been finalized. This brings us to the next topic of our discussion, that is the kinds of terrorism. Basically, there are two kinds of terrorism, which is state-sponsored terrorism and ideological terrorism. Now, state-sponsored terrorism is basically government support of violent non-state actors engaged in terrorism in other countries. State-sponsored terrorism on a massive scale appeared in the international politics during the time of 1960s and 70s for the first time. And in the recent years, some countries have embraced terrorism as a deliberate instrument of their foreign policy. And this was also exclaimed under the speech made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the recent NMFT conference. One basic distinction of state-sponsored terrorism from other form of terrorist activity is that it is initiated to obtain clearly defined foreign policy objectives rather than grabbing media attention. Thus, it operates under fewer constraints and causes greater casualty. Thus, in a cost-benefit analysis, state-sponsored terrorism is the most effective means of terrorism from perspective of the perpetrator. As countries resort to state-sponsored terrorism because it is difficult to take accountability, wars on the other hand are mostly costly, as a full-fledged response is mostly evaded. Certain examples of the state-sponsored terrorism is that of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, that is proxy war by the deep state of Pakistan in India, especially in the case of Jammu and Kashmir through Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. Western powers under the leadership of US supported all kinds of nationalist and anti-communist movement during the Cold War period. US also supported the Mujahideen movement in Afghanistan, which eventually led to the rise of Taliban. Other examples of countries using state-sponsored terrorism is that of Iran, Sudan, Iraq, etc. Another kind of terrorism present here is that of ideological. Now, ideological terrorism has basically three subheadings under it. The first subheading here is the left-wing terrorism, the second subheading here is the right-wing terrorism, and the third subheading can be categorized as the religious terrorism. Now, left-wing terrorism is the violence against the ruling elite, mostly by the peasant class, who have been motivated by the leftist ideologies. And these have occurred repeatedly in the history. Ideological basis for the left and subsequent violent movement was provided by the writings of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. Leftist ideologies believe that all the existing social relations and the state structures are in the favor of capitalist society and thus thereby exploitative, and only through a revolutionary change or through violent means freedom can be obtained. Right-wing terrorism, on the other hand, seek to maintain status quo or a return to some past situation that they feel should have been conserved. And they may also sometimes assume some of the racist character. They may also force the government to acquire a territory or to intervene to protect the rights of an oppressed minority in a neighboring country. The prime example of right-wing terrorism can be given in the form of Nazi Party. Fascists in Italy are also an example of the same, and the KKK of United States of America is also an example of the white supremacy movement that have been flourishing in the United States of America. The third ideological form of terrorism is that of religious terrorism, and present day terrorist activities are mostly motivated largely by religious imperative. Practitioners of this terrorism are motivated by a religious imperative, considering violence as their divine duty, or rather as a sacramental act, and embraces different means for the same. Now that we have seen the kinds of terrorism, this brings us to the question, what are the various causes behind the terrorism? Why terrorism emerge in any country? And thus there are various reasons behind the same. The first reason here is the historical factors, which may include injustice of the past and distortion of history at times. For example, terrorism in J&K and Northeast is a result of historical factors. Now, Kashmir issue is a result of differing interpretation of instrument of accession that was signed, while in the Northeast insurgency is mainly a result of historical policy of the British colonizers to keep the region away from the mainstream national movement. The next cause giving rise to terrorism is that of political. Political causes of terrorism emanate from lack of effective redressal of the grievances and the lack of political representation. For example, most of the Northeast India was first under the Assam. However, the political aspirations of different ethnic tribes could not be satisfied, and this led to insurgencies like that of Mizo insurgency, and finally led into the culmination of Mizo Accord. Moving on to the next cause, it can be exclaimed as religion. Now there have been several terrorist incidents which were motivated by the religious fundamentalism, and certain agencies exploit religion to promote terrorism. For example, ISI launched an initiative in 1991, even before the Babri Masjid demolition, to forge an alliance between Khalistani terrorists and terror groups of Jammu and Kashmir. Another major reason behind terrorism is that of economic causes, which includes unequal distribution of resources, lack of development, and poor socio-economic development, as these provide a fertile ground for extremist ideologies to flourish, as large proportion of recruits to the extremist group come from the deprived, marginalized section who have been disaffected by the vibrant growth in many parts of the country. This is best represented by the example of rise of Maoism in tribal areas which have generally lagged in terms of development. Moving on to the next cause, it can be categorized as the human rights violation. Human rights violation can happen at the hands of majority or even by the security forces. And this has been the case in almost all the insurgency affected area, wherein there is an abuse of AFSPA, that is Armed Forces Special Powers Act, especially in the case of Jammu and Kashmir and that of Northeast. An international example of the same can be taken in the case of Myanmar, where human rights abuse by majority and armed forces have led to the Rohingya crisis. And last but also a major cause of terrorism is that of ethnicity. An ethnic group refers to a social group that share common plus a distinctive culture, religion and language. Northeast region has a long history of conflict and violence among themselves or tribal groups. Here there is an emergence of what we today know as ethno-nationalism, which can be represented with the demand of Greater Naga Limb or the examples of Naga insurgency, Mizo insurgency, etc. Now that we have discussed the causes of terrorism, we'll also try to understand what are the effects of terrorism in brief. Now, terrorism has different impacts which ranges from economic, political, governance related issues and also social issues. First, we'll try to understand the economic effects of terrorism. Under the economic effect of terrorism leads to dislocation of economic activities. As an example of same can be seen in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, where terrorism, conflict and instability have been a major obstruction in the course of development and progress, and this can be seen with the nascent industrial sector in the states when compared to other states. The second economic impact is the damage to the property. Now this can be seen with a global example of 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers of USA, which led to the loss of lives and property due to terrorism. The towers were reduced to rubble, and also blasts in cities like Delhi and Mumbai have led to serious loss of lives and property. The next economic impact of terrorism is of higher expenditure. Higher expenditure on defense and police, as incidences of terrorism leads to a huge burden on exchequer, as it results in heavy expenditure on defense budget, which is corroborated by the fact as India's defense budget is third largest in the world, and also India is among one of the top largest importer of arms. This represents that there has been a diversion of funds which can have been utilized for the development activities and in the case of social welfare. Terrorism also leads to economic uncertainty, as was seen after the Mumbai attacks, wherein the market opened lower, and was also seen in the case after 9/11, where the financial market was literally shut down and were not able to recover until and after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This shows that market usually rally downwards when terrorist incidents occur. Another economic impact of terrorism is the decline in the investments, as business generally avoid investing in the countries that have been affected by terrorism. And another impact, though not economic, is that of psychological, as terrorist attacks have long-lasting impact on the people that are affected, and people suffer from wrong stage acute stress disorder or PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression that is developed after countering or facing any of the terrorist attack. Moving on to the political effect of a terrorist impact is that of non-engagement and the crisis of credibility. Terrorism leads to non-engagement of youth in politics, and this can be seen as a routine affair where terrorism is in charge. For example, the youths in Jammu and Kashmir are misled by the propaganda from the terror organization like that of Lashkar-e-Taiba and are attracted towards militant organizations and become spectacle to the political process. A prime example of the same from Jammu and Kashmir only can be seen after the killing of Burhan Wani in 2017, after which there were extremely low turnout in the 2017 Srinagar by-polls. The credibility is also dismissed if we take the example of similar 2017 Srinagar by-polls, as the turnout was only limited to 7% approximately, and in such a scenario, winner cannot claim to be too representative of the people of his or her constituency. Terrorism impact of governance is also important, which leads to erosion and law and order problems. There is an erosion of faith in government. For example, in Kashmir, the faith of people in the government has decreased considerably. Further, it also gives rise to the law and order problems, as terrorists as terrorists get support from the local population, as the same can be seen in the case of Jammu and Kashmir and also in the left-wing extremist areas. The last challenge of terrorism is of social problems. It leads to disintegration. The social effect of terrorism is the disintegration of the society. For example, the tribal way of life is deeply disturbed because of the left-wing extremism, as tribals are harassed both by the Maoists and at times by the police. Another example of the same is the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits due to the insurgencies in 1990s, which has disintegrated the social fabric of the place. This brings us to the next part of our discussion, which is the steps to counter terrorism. Now, the steps to counter terrorism can be divided under the broad headings of preparedness, education, use of civil society, and that of media. We'll first discuss the preparedness. Under preparedness, the first way to tackle terrorism is through intelligence gathering, which involves gathering crucial information from the ground level and collating that such that it is easily accessible to the intelligence agencies involved. Thus, the role of intelligence agencies is of utmost importance, and for this purpose, the establishment of NAT grid post 2611 is key for the analysis of the intelligence inputs and training. The next step in this regard is that of training. Training of security forces involved in counter-terrorism activities is of grave importance, and for this, counter-insurgency and anti-terror school have been established. The next in line to tackle terrorism is securing key installation, like the army bases, buildings of national importance, police station. There is a need of standard operating procedure which is basically missing that should be established to secure these key installation and which can be implemented uniformly. The next in this regard is counter-terrorism operations that needs to be undertaken when a terrorist attack takes place. NSD have been placed with a similar role for counter-terror operations. The next in this regard is political consensus. Political parties must arrive at a national consensus on the need for broad counters for such a planned strategy. The next in line is following the rule of law. Now, the respect for rule of law is very important, and government agencies must not be allowed to transgress law even in dealing with the critical situation caused by the insurgency or terrorism. Thus, police and the governmental forces must adhere to some basic codes of conduct. This will help in checking the alienation of the people and thus not fueling the already existing terrorism. The next preparatory step in this regard can be of ensuring good governance and at the same time ensuring socio-economic development, as implementation on ground with a clean and basically corruption-free and accountable administration at all levels is an imperative necessity. The next in this regard is a psychological warfare against the terrorism or the management of the information services and that of media. In the field of education, it can be basically divided under the two heads, that is changing the individual psyche and response to jihadi terrorism. The individual psyche can be changed via education, and education would make society overall more harmonious and cohesive, which is less likely to get influenced by the terrorist ideology. As a response to jihadi terrorism, which is being advocated, they need to be countered by emphasizing on the true essence of Islam, and educational institutions like madrasa and other social institutions can play a major role in spreading the true essence of Islam and advocating that one should not resort to violence. The next role to be played in this regard is by the civil society, by ensuring inclusion and by the use of human. Involving civil society in multi-dimensional response to threat of terrorism had been recognized even by the United Nations General Assembly while adopting UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy in 2006. Further, the state fight against the terrorism should involve information of local intelligence type or what we know as human intelligence. Now coming to the media can play an influential and a larger role. We have seen in our discussion earlier that terrorism is media hungry, and thus media has a very critical role to play to avoid the spread of terrorism. Media here refers to all channels of mass information and communication, which includes media like newspapers, television, and also includes that of internet or social media. Media policy should act in the principle of self-restraint, and the publishers, editors, and the reporters needs to be sensitized to avoid and exclude those elements of media coverage that may unwittingly advance the agenda of terrorists. As there have been many instances where media reports have stoked conflicts, though on several occasions have been instrumental in prevention of the violence also. Therefore, it is necessary that government should work towards harnessing the power of media as a part of its strategy to defeat terrorism, and which will require an affirmative media policy. Thus, it can be concluded that a multi-pronged approach is needed to handle menace of terrorism. It needs to be clearly understood that socio-economic development and providing a secure environment must go together, as one cannot survive without them, and socio-economic development is priority so that vulnerable sections of society do not fall prey to the propaganda of terrorists who are promising them wealth and equity. The focus should be on service delivery mechanisms which needs to be responsive to the legitimate and the long-standing grievances of the people so that these are redressed promptly and cannot be exploited by terrorist or extremist groups. Now that the conference was related to the terror financing, we need to understand the concept of terror financing, how terror financing is done, that is how money is raised, and what are the response of terror financing in India particularly. The basic definition can be understood by the fact that terrorism needs financing for recruitment, planning and executing their vicious activity. Countering the flow of resources toward terror group is thus essential to control terrorism. Now, terror financing is done by two ways. First is through external sources and the other is via internal source. We'll understand what are the components of terror financing under the external sources first. Now, a major part of funding for terrorism from the external sources come through counterfeit currency, drug trafficking, charities, NGOs, and also due to the state sponsorship, for example like that of Pakistan. The first component under our external sources is through NGOs, charities and the donation. Traditional societies in countries like Saudi Arabia have been supporting traditions and customs which encourage donation. In Pakistan, government has limited control over charities and NGOs. Terror financing is generated from NGOs and charities within Pakistan through its coordinating role in West Asia. The second source of financing under the external sources is that of macro finance. Now, drugs are a major source of terror financing. Afghanistan, in this regard, has emerged as a hub for the production of opiates, and there is evidence that terrorist groups in Pakistan are gaining access to the proceeds of drug trafficking, and these proceeds are utilized for terrorism purposes in India. Another way of raising money is via state sponsorship. Pakistan has employed its intelligence agency ISI to directly fund terrorist activities in India, and this is not only employed as a part of proxy war in J&K but also in the northeastern states. Another source of external terrorist financing is through religious donation. A primary source of traditional funding in Islam is based on Zakat. Now, this is an accepted and legal system, but sometimes it is seen that a part of this Zakat finds its way into terror financing in countries like India. Diaspora also plays an important role in terror financing. There have been charities that have been done by countries and the people of that countries who have a strong radical bent. Some charities which have been banned internationally continued with their campaign. These include organizations like Jamaat-ul-Dawa, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Hizbul Mujahideen. Remittances are another sources of terrorist financing. As link of former semi-terrorists, that is Student Islamic Movement of India and Indian Mujahideen cadres have been established with finances received from Gulf countries. Large flow of remittances into Kerala has become a concern for agencies in the recent times. Another source of terrorist financing is the production of counterfeit currency. Counterfeiting of Indian currency is not only fund terrorism, but it is also a tool to destabilize Indian economy also. Apart from the external sources, there are also some internal sources which can also boost terror financing, and these are clubbed as extortion or taxation and a medium through organized crime. Now, extortion and taxation particularly relevant in northeastern states and in the Maoist affected areas. It includes extortion from industries and levying taxes on people. Further, contracts are given to the sympathizers of terrorists to ensure a steady flow of funds from government department. Another way of linkage between organized crime and terrorism as an internal source for funding of terrorism has also emerged in the recent times. As sequence of action associated with the crime used to raise funds for terrorism go through a process of extortion to include committing criminal acts, for example, of the proceeds generated from the drug, human trafficking, smuggling, arms trade are utilized in this regard. So now that we have seen the methods of terrorist financing, that includes the external sources and the internal sources, we'll try to understand India's response or the countermeasures employed by India to counter terror financing. The first step in this regard is passing of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002. PMLA Act seeks to prevent and control money laundering, confiscate and seize property that is obtained from laundered money. The second agency involved to counter terrorist financing is the Enforcement Directorate or the ED, which is empowered to carry out investigation in offences of money laundering. It also seeks to coordinate with other countries to curb the menace of money laundering. The third step in this regard is the CFT cell, that is Combating Financing of Terrorism Cell, which has been created by the Ministry of Home Affairs in 2011 to coordinate with the Central Intelligence and Enforcement Agencies and other law enforcement agencies for an integrated approach to tackle the problem of terror funding. Further, a fake currency cell and a terror funding cell has been set up by NIA, that is the National Investigation Agency, to investigate terror funding cases. Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which has been recently amended, has been strengthened, which now includes the scope of proceeds of terrorism, any property intended to be used for terrorism, and raising funds both from legitimate as well as illegitimate sources by a terrorist organization. Further, India is also a member of international grouping like FATF, that is Financial Action Task Force, as an intergovernmental body which makes recommendations relating to combating of financing of terrorism, money laundering, etc. India is also a member of the Eurasian Group and Asia Pacific Group on money laundering, which are FATF style regional bodies. Demonetization was also taken as a step to counter the terrorist finance. So we have discussed all the aspects of terror financing and India's regional setup for the same. Moving on to the next article that has featured in the Hindu on page number 5, basically talks about India's first private rocket that lifted off from ISRO spaceport. Now this has been a historic moment for India, as India's first privately developed rocket Vikram S was launched from ISRO's launch pad in Sriharikota. This highlights the role of private space agencies, startups and organizations in India's space sector. Further, this section is also important under the GS3 section, under which achievements of India in science and technology, indigenization of technology, developing new technology, along with that, awareness in the field of space is also given. We'll try to understand the details about the launch. We'll also try to understand how this launch has benefited India and India's architecture and setup to engage private sector in the space technology. Now, the Vikram S rocket has been developed by the Hyderabad-based startup Skyroot Aerospace, a company that was started in 2018. Now, it is to remember that in 2018, India's space sector was not open to private players. Now, coming back to the Vikram S is a single-stage solid-fuel suborbital rocket with vehicle traveling slower than the orbital velocity. What does it mean? It means that while the vehicle will reach outer space, it will not remain in the orbit around the Earth. Now, the Vikram series of rockets that have been developed by the Skyroot is named after Vikram Sarabhai, the founder of Indian space program. It is part of mission Prarambh. These rockets are among the few launch vehicles in the world which have their core structure built using carbon composites, and the thrusters that are used for spin stability are also of considerable importance, as they have been 3D printed. The engine that was used in the launch vehicle was named after former President Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. Further, the Skyroot Aerospace is India's first space startup to sign an agreement to use ISRO launch and test facility after the government opened the space to private companies for the first time in the year 2020. As a part of mission Prarambh, there are other series of rockets which are set to be launched. Now, this raises the question how this rocket launch is beneficial for India or how it positions India. The launch marks a new beginning in the Indian space sector. which has been so far under the sole domain of Indian Space Research Organization or ISRO. The Indian Space Agency has been solely responsible for developing, designing and launching of rockets missions into the space up till now. The launch of the Prarambh series of mission will mark a new age with the private sector now shouldering a part of burden of public organization. Further, this is crucial as the private sector is capable of not just developing and designing these launch vehicles but also attracting customers and investment into the sector, which has largely been dependent on the public exchequer as of now. This can be seen as a humble beginning in the field of space technology from the private sector, as it is developed on a scale which is much larger developed in USA in comparison to SpaceX and Blue Origin. Now that we have discussed how it is beneficial for India in attracting customers as well as investment, this brings us to the next set of questions, that what are the Indian efforts that have been made till now to boost private sector and its involvement in space. Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center has been opened, which is known as InSpace. InSpace facilitates private sector participation as it is a single window, independent and a nodal agency which functions autonomously under the Department of Space. This agency has been developed with the sole aim and the role to boost the private sector economy in India. InSpace is thus responsible for promotion, enabling, authorize and supervise various space activities that include building of the launch vehicle, satellites and providing space-based services. Further, it also provides for sharing of space infrastructure and premises under the control of Department of Space or ISRO. Another important feature that has been provided with the InSpace is the establishment of new space infrastructure and facilities. The next organization that we will talk about is NSIL, that is New Space India Limited. Now, New Space India Limited has been established as a public sector undertaking of Government of India and a commercial arm of the ISRO. Again, it is established under Department of Space just like InSpace. And the main objective of the NSIL is to scale up private sector participation in the Indian space program. We'll try to understand what is the mandate that has been provided with the NSIL. Now, NSIL has been provided with the mandate of owning satellites. Owning satellites for Earth observation and providing space-based services. Further, it will help in satellite building on demand. It will also help in providing launch services for satellite belonging to customers. It will help in building launch vehicle through Indian industry and launch as per the satellite customer requirement. Further, space-based services is also to be provided by NSIL. This will include services like that of communication satellites on commercial basis. Further, as a part of mandate, it will also enable technology transfer to Indian industry. So now that we have seen two of the organizations that have been established to boost private sector demand, this brings us to the question, what are the advantages of bringing in private sector under this? The first advantage of private sector in the space is that it will take up the commercial and other routine activities, whereas ISRO will now focus more on deep space mission and exploration activities. Further, it will bring the required revenue for the government which can be invested for research and development. It will also help in creation of jobs, and high-skilled jobs will be created in the Indian space industry. Now, as a country, India is rapidly growing, and it will help in satisfy the growing demands of space-based services that the country is in dire need of. Further, this will also attract investment in the sector and reduce the dependency on the public money. However, despite of the advantages, there are certain key challenges that the involvement of private sector will bring in. The first challenge here is that of regulation. Now, ISRO will be burdened to regulate the activities of private players, as ISRO needs to play the role of regulator as well as facilitator. Further, it will create a problem of data protection, as space missions provide crucial data with respect to geographical locations and telecommunication services. It can be misused by the private players. Further, there is a high risk involvement, as space missions are very risky endeavor and private players may find it difficult to bear the cost of failure. And at the last, another challenge for the same is absence of clear guidelines. There are no specific guidelines for the private sector with respect to their involvement in space sector. So now that we have seen the set of problems and the advantages of bringing in private sector, we will discuss what can be the way forward such that these challenges are addressed. To avoid overburdening of ISRO, we need to have independent agency for regulation. ISRO should only play a role of facilitator and providing technical expertise for the same. There should be a mechanism for data protections such that the public data is not misused for private gains or profit. There is a need to collaborate with foreign countries like United States of America, Russia to gather the cutting edge technology such that to minimize the chances of mishaps, and a clear-cut policy is needed to promote private participation by incentivizing them and to absolve any ambiguity that is present. Now moving on to the last article of the day that has featured on page 10 of the Hindu, basically talks about KASHI-TAMIL meet in Varanasi. Now Prime Minister Modi will formally inaugurate the month-long KASHI-TAMIL SAMAGAM in Varanasi. Now this 30-day event is aimed at rediscovering the centuries-old bond of knowledge and ancient civilization linkages between the country's north and south. Further, this will also give a glimpse of Dravidian culture and the cuisine and music of Tamil Nadu to people of Uttar Pradesh. We'll now try to analyze what are the basic features of this Samagam that is being inaugurated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and what is the story behind this. So what is the history of ties between Kashi and Tamil Nadu? As per the legends, it is said that King Parakarama Pandya, who ruled over the region around Madurai in the 15th century, wanted to build a temple that was dedicated to Lord Shiva. He travelled to Kashi to bring back a lingam from there. While returning to Madurai, he rested under a tree, but when he tried to continue his journey, the cow carrying the lingam refused to move. King Parakrama Pandya understood this as the wish of the Lord and installed the lingam there, a place which came to be known as Sivakasi. For devotees who could not visit Kashi, the Pandyas had built the Kashi Vishwantar temple in what is today Tenakasi in southwestern Tamil Nadu, close to the state's border with Kerala. Much later, another king, Adhivir Ram Pandyan, after returning from pilgrimage to Kashi, constructed another Shiva temple in Tenkasi in the 19th century. Further, Sant Kumara Guruppa from Toothukudi district had negotiated with the princely state of Kashi to get a place for conservation of Kedar Ghat and Vishwabesara Lingam in Varanasi. He also composed, that is Sant Kumara Gurupa composed Kashi Kamalambam, a collection of grammar poems on Kashi. So this was the historical and cultural aspect of the Kashi and Tamil Nadu connect. Now we'll try to understand what is the KASHI-TAMIL Samagam. The month-long KASHI-TAMIL Samagam will begin in Varanasi. This will celebrate many aspects of historical and civilization connection between India's north and south. As a part of this Samagam, 2,400 people from Tamil Nadu will be taken to Varanasi in groups for visit that will last 8 days and will include local experience, trips to Ayodhya and Prayagraj as well. So what is the basic objective or the broader objective behind this is to bring two knowledge and cultural traditions of north and the south closer and create a joint understanding of our shared heritage and deepen the people-to-people bond between the regions. This is in sync with the national education policy that was announced in 2020, which emphasizes on nurturing a generation that is modern and is in sync with 21st century mindset, while also being rooted in the Indian culture and ethos at the same time. Further, a thing to remember is that BHU and IIT Madras are the knowledge partners for the event, and Ministries of Culture, Tourism, Railways, Textiles and Food Processing have been roped in as a stakeholder beside active participation from the government of Uttar Pradesh. So with this, we have discussed the historical linkage between Kashi and Tamil Nadu and also understood what is the idea behind KASHI-TAMIL Sangamam.